Hi everyone. For anyone who's watching on YouTube, my name is Rosie, and I'm going to be talking about bats and artificial lighting and running a sort of short training into what the problems are and what we can do when we're sort of progressing with developments and how we can mitigate against the impacts of artificial lighting. So first of all, what is the problem with artificial lighting? So in 2010, it was ranked as one of the top 10 issues in biodiversity conservation, and this is only expected to be increasing due to increased urbanisation and encroachment on natural habitats. Over 80% of the world population and over 99% of the US and the EU population live under light polluted skies. This doesn't just have an impact of the lighting itself, it also can contribute to climate change. So in 2006, lighting contributed 3 times more CO2 than aviation at the time. Obviously, that figure may be different now because aviation has massively increased, but it still shows that the impact on greenhouse gas emissions that lighting can have. So there are 2 main problems with artificial lights. The first thing is introducing light that is in naturally dark places at unnatural times. And then there's also the issue with introducing light of wavelengths that are different to natural types. So for instance, daylight, moonlight, or starlight. So in terms of bats, there are 3 main reasons why bats react to lighting, due to their predation risk, their prey availability, and their spatial orientation ability. So in terms of predation, bats have evolved in the UK to be crepuscular or nocturnal. And this is partly due to the fact they're less easier to spot during the nighttime and they can avoid daytime predators such as raptors. If lighting is obviously present, then that's going to influence that predation risk. In terms of prey, in the UK, all our bats are insectivorous and they consume moths and other invertebrates which come out at night. Many species of bats' emergence times from their roost coincide with the peak abundance of the insect prey of choice. So, for instance, brown long-eared tend to emerge later at night, which is at the same time as the moth prey that they feed upon comes out. And spatial orientation. So although there's the saying blind as a bat, many bats do receive inputs. Not many bats, all bats receive inputs from both their vision and their echolocation. They mainly rely on their echolocation, but lighting can dazzle a bat's vision and impede their spatial orientation. Not all bats react the same way to lighting, so there are 2 main groups. There are light-tolerant bats and light-adverse bats. And these responses are said to be species specific, depending on their wing size and shape, a bat's speed of flight, and a bat's echolocation call structure. So light-tolerant bats tend to utilise long and powerful echolocation calls, which are suited for catching more aerial insects across far open ranges and open areas or along edge habitats. So in the UK, this is our pipistrelles, our noctules, liselers, and ceratines. Then you have the light-adverse bats, who have echolocation pulses that are suitable more for the short-range detection of insects in cluttered environments. So in the UK, this is our myotis bats, long-eared bats, barbastels, and horseshoes. And in the UK, some of our rarest bats are more light-adverse. So for instance, Bechsteins, barbastels, and grey long-eareds are all light-adverse species. Speed of flight is the main characteristic that influence whether a bat is a light-tolerant bat or a light-adverse bat. So slow-flying species have an increased predation risk, which is way too high to compensate for the increased foraging ability under lights. Basically, this means that if they are less likely to go get a snack under the light if they're going to become a snack themselves. This has been supported by a negative correlation between a bat's flight speed and their emergence time. So, for instance, brown long-eared and myotis bats tend to be the last to emerge, as many of us know on emergence surveys. And long-eared bats do conduct light sampling behaviour before emerging from roosts to ensure that the light levels are sufficient that they're not going to be easily spotted by a daytime predator. It's also been found that Coul's pipistrelles and Bottus ceratines, which are both more arid environment bats, have been observed flying faster when foraging under the lights. So they are aware that there is increased risk being under the lights, and they do compensate for that. So it was the case that light-tolerant bats were actually called light-attracted, but this has changed due to some increased information, which I'll go into later. So foraging. So all light-tolerant bat species have been recorded foraging under streetlights, this including our ceratines, pipistrelles, noctules, liselers. And they are drawn to the high accumulations of invertebrate prey, which means, so basically the light can attract invertebrates and insects, and therefore the bats can tap into this resource. It's also beneficial for specific bat species. So, for instance, moths become stunned by lighting and start to behave as if they're flying during daylight. So it basically means that they switch off their ultrasound responses thinking it's daytime. And this means that bats that normally have echolocation calls that overlap with moths, meaning that the moths know that they're there, actually have an increased foraging rate for these invertebrates. This has actually even caused a selection pressure for a particular species of bat in Italy, who have actually evolved larger skulls in the last 65 years, which has found to correlate with streetlights being introduced in the country at the same time. So the concentration of invertebrate prey can cause something called a vacuum effect, which basically means that all the available prey resources under the streetlights, that means that light-tolerant bats can exploit this resource, but it also means that the light-adverse bats can't. This puts them at a competitive disadvantage and they lose out on important food resources. Lighting can also disrupt the composition of insect prey. So, for instance, UV light can attract Noctuidae moth more than Geometridae moths. And if a light-adverse bat is more specialist on a Noctuidae moth, then they're going to lose out on that important prey resource. But is lighting actually all that great for the light-tolerant bats? Tolerant doesn't mean unaffected. So even the most light tolerant of species avoid intense light. For example, common pipistrelles tend to avoid crossing roads at strongly lit gaps. Lighting can also can be locally beneficial to light tolerant bats, but can disadvantage them on wider scales. And it's actually been suggested that lighting has no net positive effects for most European species. Bats also attracted to artificial light means that they're more likely to be predated upon by urban predators. So, for instance, if a bat is foraging under a streetlight and there's a cat about, they might be more at risk of being eaten by one. And then it's also the case that foraging isn't the only behaviour that's impacted by light. Reproduction, roosting, commuting are one of the many behaviours that are also influenced by light, which I will go into now. So first of all, we have commuting. It's for all species. It's been found that activity has been reduced along lit commuting routes, and this is particularly prevalent for lesser horseshoe bats. So there's actually a 5-fold decrease in activity along lit hedgerows, with impacts on this species as low as 3.6 lux, which is really quite dim light. There's been some GPS tracking studies of noctules in Berlin, and this has found that they avoid lit roads and paths despite foraging over water bodies and woodlands, so suggesting that their commuting behaviour is actually influenced by light. The main consequence of lighting a commuting route is habitat fragmentation. So the lighting can act as barriers to foraging or commuting grounds, and this can lead to bats using more poorer commuting routes, which can have a higher energetic cost if they're longer or more risky. Particularly, this is an issue for pregnant and lactating females, which are already under a significant energetic stress. Alternatively, it can actually completely isolate bats from their commuting habitat, from their foraging ranges, and this can lead to roost abandonment or even death in really extreme circumstances. As I mentioned before in one of the first slides, that lighting can also impact a bat's spatial orientation, and this can increase their risk of collision with vehicles and other objects. So there was a study on little brown bats in Canada that actually found that bats were literally crashing into a trailer that was lit up in the basically these ecologists were doing some trapping studies, and they found that the bats were crashing into their trailer when they were lighting it up so that they could look at the bats and investigate them, and they found that actually the light was complicating a bat's flight solution and resulted in the failure of orientation by echolocation. So basically they had to rely on their vision, which isn't sufficient and is being dazzled, so they were really at a disadvantage and therefore crashed. So roosting. Lighting has impacts on roosting in varying different strengths. So lights can delay emergence time, which can mean that bats have less time to forage and they may end up out of sync with their peak in abundance of their prey. There's also the case of roost abandonment as a result of lighting. So if a roost entrance has been illuminated, it can lead to bats just not going back to that roost. There's some of the worst cases has been in Sweden. So there's been some really long-term studies on Swedish churches, and they have seen that with the introduction of floodlighting, brown long-eared bats are starting to abandon their roosts. The effect is strongest when the building has been illuminated from all directions, but even in partially illuminated buildings, colonies started to decline over the years and eventually leading to complete roost abandonment. There's also the case of roost entombment. So this is where bats can't actually leave their roost because of their entrances are being lit up. This has happened in for multiple different bat species, many Myotis bats especially. And one of the worst cases of roost entombment was in Germany, when there was a case that thousands of bats actually died after the lights were left on inside a church for a period of time. And there's also been a study in Norfolk that has had to be prematurely terminated when a natterer's roost was lit up, and it actually resulted in no bats emerging from the building. So when the lights were switched back on, bats did emerge, but they emerged a lot earlier, which suggested that they were energetically stressed. And even in soprano pipistrelle colonies, there's been evidence of less bats emerging when the roost entrance was illuminated. And also the lighting has an impact on growth rates of juveniles. So a Hungarian study on multi-species roosts found that bats that had a roost with outside illumination actually also had lower juvenile growth rates. So it's not only impacting the current generation, but also future generations of bats. Other behaviours that are found to be impacted by light, drinking. So both light adverse and light tolerant bats have been found to drink less in lit areas. Migration, so Nethusius and soprano pipistrelles have actually been found to be attracted to lights when migrating along coastal landscapes, which is quite different to a lot of the other sort of behaviours, but it's something that's quite interesting and something that is quite significant. If you've got sort of offshore lights, it will disrupt their migration. And hibernation. So there are actually very few studies to no studies on hibernation, but the negative impacts are likely similar to roosting, such as the avoidance of hibernation sites, and it could also lead to the arousal from torpor for a lot of bats. But it isn't only just bats that are affected. There are pretty much thousands of studies on artificial lights, and they cover many different species groups. This is a sort of a list of a couple. There's like the different impacts on different sort of species groups. So you've got the top left here, you've got invertebrates. So as I mentioned before, lighting can accumulate invertebrate populations, but it's also been found on wild scales to lead to massive population declines. And there's been some really recent studies that have found that moth caterpillar abundance and development has actually been influenced by lighting. So their reproduction and all stages of the life cycle are influenced by light. In terms of small mammals such as rodents, there's been few studies on beach mice that have found that they actually exploit fewer food resources that are lit up. But there's also evidence that more urban specialist species such as hedgehogs actually aren't influenced by light as much, and this is likely a consequence of them sort of being used to high levels of light. But it is still the case that mammals are affected by lighting. In terms of amphibians, anyone who's done any torching surveys of GCN have found that the newts do not like artificial lights and do not like torches. But lighting has also been found to influence toad behaviour. So it deters the toads during migration, but also can aggregate juvenile toads. And this is particularly an issue when you've got toad crossings. Toads just accumulate under streetlights and then get hit by cars. For birds, lighting has been influencing their phenology for quite a long time. So it's been found to influence egg laying. So a lot of birds will actually lay earlier in the year in lit habitats, and then it's also found to influence dawn song and means that they start their dawn song a lot earlier in the morning rather than the normal time. And then plants, which I think is quite an interesting one. Artificial lights have been found to alter the species composition and phenology of grazed grassland habitat. It's also been found to it would make deciduous trees retain their leaves for longer. And there was a study in the University of Exeter that actually found that the bud burst of large leaf lime trees actually occurred 2 weeks earlier on individual trees that were lit up compared to trees that weren't lit up. So there's a lot of interesting information out there, and it's only more and more studies coming out as lighting people realise that lighting actually is a really big issue. Has anyone got any questions at this point before I go into the next bit?
I have one, if that's okay. I've seen recently a couple of trials where people are using red light on motorways, I think, instead of white light, thinking this is beneficial for bats. But just seeing your slide earlier that sopranos, and I can't remember what the other species was, are attracted to it. What are your thoughts on that?
It's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be there's actually, I'll go into a little bit later actually, but I think in terms of using it for, it would have to be like, if you're using particular lighting types, you'll have to use it for different situations. So if you've got an area where you know there's a big migration path of soprano and enthusiasts, then there will have to be like more sensitive lighting used there. But it's a really interesting study that really confused me when I first found it, because it kind of goes against a lot of other things that have happened, because they actually found in that study that it wasn't due to the invertebrate prey that was concentrating the bats. It was actually just completely away from foraging. So it will be interesting to see what's happening there, really.
Yeah, definitely. All right, thank you. That was all.
No worries. Okay, so right, so now I'm going to go into a bit more about lighting types and sort of the different things you'll come across in a development plan maybe, and just generally some of the terminology that's quite often used by lighting technicians, which is quite useful to understand. Maybe not completely, but it's a useful point. So first of all, this is really taking back to GCSE or O-level physics. The electromagnetic spectrum, I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible, but basically the reason I say about this is that different light sources have different spectrums and they emit different wavelengths of light. I'm just going to get my lace pointer up here because it's a bit easier to show. So a light has a particular wavelength of light sorry, let me start that again. So different wavelengths of light are cause different spectrums, and therefore the different sort of the different things that we perceive. So we perceive visible radiation or visible light, which is between 380 and 750 nanometers. So it's this bit here. And then you've got more shorter wavelength light from there is UV, and longer wavelength light from there is infrared. So smaller bats tend to be more sensitive to the bluer visible and UV light. So this here, whereas they tend to be less sensitive to the redder wavelengths, redder visible light and infrared radiation. So yeah, that's going to kind of be a theme with lighting types, but it isn't something you need to worry too much about. So different lights have different wavelengths, and you can see here all the spectral graphs of some of the sort of main street lighting types that are used across the UK. And then on the bottom right here, you've got the daylight. So this shows that daylight is quite broad spectrum, whereas some lights are actually more narrow spectrum. So low pressure sodium here and high pressure sodium here are very narrow spectrum and tend to be produce only more orangey visible light wavelengths. So this is why they've got this sort of orangey appearance when you see in the roads. Whereas more metal halide and mercury vapor lights, they also are narrow spectrum, but they produce more bluey light. So that's why they've got that sort of green or blue tinge to them. And these lights also produce a lot of UV. So this is these sort of peaks here. And then you have LED lights, which are most broad spectrum lights. So they try to mimic daylight quite a lot. So you can see there's quite similarities between these two spectral graphs. And they're becoming increasingly more popular, which is leading to sort of changes in how our streets look and how sort of external lighting is used. So many streetlights, as I said, are being sort of changed or upgraded, is quite often called, to LEDs. So this is due to their daylight mimicking abilities, and also due to the fact that they're more energy efficient and the cost is a lot lower for them. But it is changing streetscapes, not necessarily for the better in terms of wildlife value. So this is something that needs to be addressed a bit more frequently. So there's not only light wavelengths that need to be concerned about when talking about lighting, there's also the correlated color temperature. So the official definition of this is the color appearance of the light emitted by a source when heated to a particular temperature. Basically, it's what the light looks like when, in more simple terms, it's expressed in Kelvin ratings. So the more lower Kelvin ratings are warmer looking lights, and whereas the more higher Kelvin ratings are more cooler or whiter looking lights. This is a lot easier to see when you've got actual examples. So here's a lamp that is 2200 kelvins, and then here's a lamp 2700, and here's 3000. You can see from there, but you can see quite evidently that it's a lot more orangey glow when it's a warmer light, whereas it's a lot more harsher, whiter light when it's higher Kelvin rating. Quite often the lights that you see in hospitals, those really harsh white lights, they're quite a cool, high correlated current temperature, or a cooler light. There's also a really nice diagram here that shows like how light would look differently depending on its correlated color temperature. This is mainly relevant to broad spectrum lights such as LEDs. And in relation to bats, we want to have as warm a light as possible because this is more mimicking this reddier glow that we know bats are less sensitive to. So other keywords in relation to lighting, I'm not going to go through all these. You can, and if you're on YouTube, you can pause the video and have a look at them. The main ones I just want to point out is illuminance and luminance. These are relating to the light's intensity. And then also light spill. So this is the sort of the light that isn't useful, or falling outside of a light cone. So basically, in sort of strange sense, you can kind of perceive it as light pollution or a non-useful light. And this is really what we want to minimize in developments that have got sensitive landscapes, because this spill light is quite often the lights that's going to influence bats. As much so, or even more so sometimes, than useful light. So in terms of legal requirements for lighting, there is no legislation requiring an area or a road to be lit. However, there is a British standard that says that emergency lighting needs to be lighting an escape route from a building, and this needs to be 1 lux. Apart from that, there's no requirement for a road to be lit, or a building itself to be lit. However, when there is a lighting management plan, local authorities must ensure that the plans account for protected species presence. So if there's a known roost in an area, or if there's a known commuting route, they must account for that when designing their lighting strategies. And this consideration may be required to cover areas that are outside the red line boundary. For instance, if there's a street that's connecting to an existing infrastructure, such as a road, then you need to account for the light that's actually happening outside of your main development zone. So I'm just going to ask a question here and see if anyone's got any ideas. So how can we mitigate the impacts of artificial lighting on bats? Does anyone sort of have any plans or any questions at this stage?
So you can make sure that it's all downward facing, and none of it is upward facing, and also make sure that none of it's actually directed onto any natural habitats.
Yeah, that's good. Those are good points. Definitely. Dan, have you got any sort of points in the comments, because you can't talk? Don't know if I want to type or not. No worries. Yeah, that's a really good point to start off with, Kate. Definitely avoiding sort of upward spill of light, and then also in sensitive areas. So this is the sort of main. Don't know why that's gone like that. There we go. So this is the sort of main solutions that I've kind of come up with based on the guidelines and sort of general information that's out there. And I'll go into a bit more detail as to what each one of these means. Yeah. So first of all, we have avoidance. So this obviously mitigation hierarchy, we want to avoid, if possible, mostly at the highest point. So the BCT guidelines state that if lighting has significant adverse impacts upon the favourable conservation status of the bat population, then it must be avoided, or appropriately sized buffer zone established. So basically, the main key habitats that we want to avoid, or key areas we want to avoid in development, is anywhere that's got a roosting or a swarming site, and also foraging and commuting habitat for more light adverse bats, large numbers of bats, or the rarer species, and also the flight of paths associated with the above habitats. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. If you've got an industrial site that requires 24-hour operation for safety, then obviously that can be changed. But if possible, trying to reduce and minimise lighting is the best thing to do. There's also timing, so you can use something called part night lighting, which means that you have lighting that avoids peak bat activity times. The key bat activity times need to be based on survey data from your bat activity surveys, but they has been found to be really beneficial, including in riparian habitats, where there was a study that was conducted that found that lighting up sort of rivers and the riparian area, riparian habitats, actually didn't have found the part night lighting scheme was most beneficial for commuting and foraging bats. There's also the case of dimming or turning off the lights when not in use, so not specifically turning them off at certain times, but if there's using sensors or timers to reduce the amount of time that a light is on and only use it when it's actually needed. And then there's also the potential to limit lighting to seasons with lower bat activity, such as winter. This does come with caveats, though. Bats are still sometimes active during the milder winter months, especially in the south, and you do need to still avoid illuminating hibernation roosts or transient roosts. So another solution is spatial patterning. So this is basically the considerate placement of particularly light producing areas of your development to avoid more key bat habitat. So there's consideration with the placement of your footpaths, open space and windows to avoid areas that are going to produce, to avoid areas that are going to be subject to a lot of light spill. And then there's also the potential to place hard landscaping schemes to block the spill to key bat habitat. This isn't just external patterning, there's also internal patterning as well. So limiting internal light, so windows, can also be very beneficial for reducing light spill. And also there's the potential to place buildings that are taller in the centre of your development. So if there's a taller building, then but it's right away from the sensitive bat habitat, then the spill is going to be reduced, and therefore it hopefully shouldn't reach that sensitive area. So this has got a lot to do with dark buffer zones. So basically, it means that the development will get sectioned out into different zones. So zone A would have your key bat habitat, and then as you go into the more sort of core development zone, the lighting will reduce. This can be supported by using illuminance or lux contour plans, which basically shows how far all the lighting fixtures that are exist in the development will sort of spill out into the local area. And basically avoid the key bat habitat, but then you can have more less lighting restrictions in the development zone. There's also the potential to use planting schemes to influence reduce your impact of lighting. So tree cover can mediate the impact of lighting at crossing points, but it also actually has an negative impact in itself, lighting up woodlands. So you need to be a bit careful when using trees as a sort of solution for a lighting problem. And the planting cannot compensate for the negative effect of floodlights on long-eared bat species in particular. So it's something to use, but with the sort of sensitive scheme. Quite often, planting schemes also take a really long number of time, require a number of years until they're effective screening tools. So using supplementary planting or planting schemes is not a silver bullet, but it can be beneficial in more nuanced ways. So lighting design, so making sure that your external lighting is designed in a way that is least limiting. So currently the Bats and Lighting Guidance recommends the following. So the light spectra should be of a peak wavelength over 550 nanometers and should be of a warm color temperature, so a reduced Kelvin rating. There's no real threshold for lighting intensity given in the guidance, but as low as possible, less than 3 lux for greater horseshoes or lesser horseshoe areas, and also having light that has minimal UV, so no metal halide or mercury vapor lights. And then also having an upward light ratio of 0% and good optical control, which basically means that you're reducing, as you said before, Kate, that upward spilling light. This is quite often why LEDs are used in lighting development. So because they have a customizable element. So they have no UV light, and you can control the spectra and the temperature that they have been produced at. and they also have the energy efficiency. So even though a lot of people do say that the increased use of LEDs is a bad thing, it is, when used in a sensitive manner, it can actually be quite beneficial, as they are the most customizable lights. So in terms of the upward light ratio of 0%, this has relevance to light distribution curves. So quite often a lighting engineer would produce these, or the specs of the lights would show one of these. It's basically, what it's showing is the sort of distribution of light produced by the bulb. So for instance, in a bare bulb, then your light, the light that's going to be produced is going to be of sort of to the side and below the light. This can look quite confusing, quite daunting, but when you see sort of different lighting types, it makes a lot more sense. So in this, there's a couple of other situations here. So for instance, in a standard sort of lampshade, you've got light spill out the top of the lamp, and then you've also got light spill from the bottom. So that's why there's that show of light downwards and upwards. And then, as you mentioned before, Kate, fixture design is really important. So having bollard or low-level downward luminaires is the best option if possible, and also having small column heights and no upward tilt of light. So this is basically, if you can, where possible, just use the really small path lights, and try and discourage, or not discourage, but limit street lights to less sensitive areas. Baffles, hoods and louvres can be used to reduce and direct the light spill. This is also really useful for the more higher sort of street lighting. And then the last things that can be used in some situations is glazing treatments. So low transition glazing treatments can be used on glass to reduce light spill. So this is in really sensitive areas. It's becoming somewhat more used in high-rise buildings in more sort of district zones. It's basically called smart glass, and it can be set to automatically obscure during the darkness hours. Automatic blinds are also a more budget option for this, but they are still quite expensive. So it's if it's a really sensitive area that these should be being encouraged. So those are really the main solutions. So the main sort of workflow for producing a sensitive lighting design is basically do your desk study and ecological surveys, and to get as much information as possible about the areas, the site, and sort of how it's being utilised by bats. And then from there, you can use that information to design the avoidance of key habitats and features, and then the rest of the development can be designed to sort of mitigate impacts, or setting dark buffers and sort of landscaping the development so that it has a minimal impact as much as possible. And then the last thing is usually demonstrating that there's a compliance with lux limits and buffers. So this would be in involvement with a lighting professional who will develop a scheme design, including luminance or lux contour plans, which will show how much light is being produced and where it's actually spilling out to. So that's really the main sort of aspects I've got to say. These are the takeaway messages, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.